Hello and welcome to the fourth webinar in the NACW virtual series. I'm Jennifer Weiss with the Climate Action Reserve, and I'll just start off with a quick apology for the tardiness in starting. As what happens with virtual events, sometimes we run into some technical difficulties. So currently we are without our moderator, JP Brisson, but we're working on getting him joined in. And until he does join us, Craig Ebert, who is president of the Climate Action Reserve, will be filling in. And I will just turn it over to Craig right now. Over to you, Craig.
Thanks, Jenny. If you could move it to the next slide, please, I'd appreciate it. On behalf of the Climate Action Reserve, I want to thank all of you for attending today's webinar. We're hoping to see everybody live and in person in San Francisco a couple of months back. For obvious reasons, that did not happen. But we are doing a series of these webinars to highlight some of the key topics that would have occurred at the full conference in San Francisco. I want to take this opportunity to thank the ongoing support that we get from our sponsors and exhibitors, as you can see on the slide here. Frankly, without their support this year and over the years, these events would not be possible. And just on behalf of the Reserve, I wanted to thank all of them for their help and participation in our mission. Next slide, please. It is my pleasure to introduce our fabulous panel today. It's a really interesting topic, and we're going to be hearing from Steve Bohlen. He's the Program Manager for Energy and Homeland Security at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Also, Maris Densmore. She's the Manager of Carbon Capture Solutions at California Resources Corporation. Julio Friedmann. He's a Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And Beth Vallejo, who's the VP Strategy and Stakeholder Relations at the International Knowledge Center. At this point, I would turn it over to JP, but as Jenny mentioned, JP is having difficulties. So I wanted to kick off the discussion here. We've got a lot of territory to cover here. And I want to remind everyone that we are recording this session. It will be posted on our website within a couple of days. We're also going to have questions at the tail end here. I suspect we won't have time to get to all of them, but we will address all the questions and get back to the questioners as best we can. So let me just tee up the first question, which is, what is carbon capture and storage, and why is it important? And Julio, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to North American Carbon World for having me. It's a delight to be here, and I look forward to getting your comments and questions soon. If we could go to the first slide, it's helpful to just have a little bit of background on CCS. People know what a wind turbine is, people know what a gas plant is, they often don't know what CCS is. So it's worth explaining for a minute, and its role in climate. First and foremost, if you really want to get to deep decarbonization, if you want to get to net zero, CCS is required. There are many studies that support this. This diagram is one from the International Energy Agency. I put up 4 quotes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The punchline is that if you don't have CCS, 50% of the models fail. They simply can't solve what needs to be solved. And all of the 2-degree scenarios have a lot of CCS. If you have a 1.5-degree model, they not only have a lot of CCS, but they also have a lot of CO2 removal using things like bioenergy with CCS or direct air capture with CCS. If you look at that chart, you can see that the size of CCS in the power industry, or CCS as applied to industrial facilities, is about the same size as something like wind, or it's about the same size as something like EVs. It has every bit the same kind of volume and role that most of the other scenarios can. And if we fail at any of these things, we will simply need more CCS. Next slide. Another way to think about this is just existing stocks. And I think this is always a helpful framing. The International Energy Agency said, hey, we're just going to look at what has already been built or what is being built. And if you do that and you want to hit a 2-degree climate target, already the existing capital stock consumes 95% of that budget. So if you don't decarbonize from existing sources, you can't build anything ever. which is not really viable. So CCS buys you headroom for additional things you want to do within a 2-degree budget. Next slide. Last but not least, I wanted to show this one just to give you a sense of how this can be applied. We'll talk more about this later. A lot of people think about CCS as a specific kind of power technology, like it's good for coal. That is simply not the case. Another panelist will speak more about this. But this was a study that Ernie Moniz's group, the Energy Futures Initiative, did last year. And they show that if you look at a place like California, which is already extremely clean, the biggest levers you can pull are all CCS levers. Natural gas capture in the power sector, light duty vehicle fuel reduction through the LCFS using CCS, and CCS on industry. So think about this like a Swiss Army knife. It can be applied in many sectors and to many positive ends. With that, I turn it back to you, Craig.
Thanks. I think one of the related questions that comes up is just what's the level of applicability from a geologic standpoint for addressing CCS? Specifically, what type of geology do you need to inject CO2? Maris, can I turn that over to you to start off that conversation?
Yeah, for sure. And it's, you know, capturing it is one thing, but obviously we need a place to put it. And fortunately, globally, we've got a lot of options for that. And the most common one is in saline formation. So these are deep geologic formations. They contain water with, you know, high concentrations of dissolved solids. And these are very deep waters that are of very poor quality. So it's not something that humans are ever going to need or going to access. So they're down there. We don't know, we know they're there. We don't know a huge amount about them. So there's a lot, if you're looking at CCS in these locations, that you would need to study about them, but they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. But a lot of work is required when you actually want to potentially look at permanent sequestration. Another location is oil and gas fields, and this can be done through enhanced oil recovery, which is where a lot of the CCS to date has happened, and that's where you inject CO2 into the reservoirs, and you do that to maintain pressure as you're taking out oil and natural gas. You're putting CO2 in to support that extraction, but also to permanently sequester the CO2. And in those fields, you know, you have these depleted pressures, both in active fields that are still producing oil and natural gas, but also in fields that are no longer producing, and so they just have space in them. And the nice thing about these is that we know a lot about them because we've extracted the oil and natural gas out of them, and we also know that they can actually hold the CO2 because in some cases, for millions of years, they've been holding methane and oil and other hydrocarbons. So these are a good place to do it, but they're not quite as widespread. Some of the slightly less common options are in coal seams. You can inject CO2 into coal seams, and the coal actually geochemically binds to the CO2, and so you're getting this geochemical sequestration, and as opposed to like the physical sequestration and still geochemical that you're getting in the other two options. And also with some basalt, so volcanic rock, you can do it in there, and that's some early work is going on for the geology and on doing basalt. And in California, where I operate, we're mostly looking at those saline formations, the first one I mentioned, and the oil and gas fields. And you can see in the slide that you know, it's kind of got the whole life cycle of what's going on for CCS, but it shows, you know, how deep these things actually are. You're talking a sort of minimum of 800 meters deep, and way below where much is going on. Where people are getting water from is generally much shallower, and you can see the little pop out where it's actually being entrained inside these reservoirs. So they need to be porous and permeable. They need to have something on top that's keeping the CO2 in. So there's a lot that's required, but there's also a lot of options that we have globally and in California. So
thanks, Maris, for that overview of the geologic characteristics. I think one follow-up question is, where are these types of sites located here in California, in the US, and internationally? Steve, is that something you could address, please?
Yes, thank you, Craig. Actually, following on what Maris just said, obviously one place to look is where the world's oil fields are. That is a place where Mother Nature has held hydrocarbons for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And so we know those are pretty good containers to hold supercritical, or what would really otherwise to the layman be a liquid CO2. It turns out that in California, for example, Mother Nature has been particularly kind. And the reason I'm going to focus on California is that it exemplifies some of the best places around the planet to store CO2. And that is in relatively young sedimentary basins. And so in central US and in California, there are very large sedimentary basins. In California, they're quite young. They're several million to a few tens of millions years old. They have high porosity, a lot of pore space, and they have good permeability, so you can inject the fluids relatively easily. And in fact, some of the best geology in the world is in California, because some of these formations have 35 and 40% pore space. But globally, you look for places, oil and gas fields, and you look for sedimentary basins where there are interbedded sandstones. Those are the rocks that typically have high porosity and permeability, and then shales, compressed mudstones, and so forth, that actually seal the reservoirs and prevent migration of the fluids from escaping from the reservoir that they are intended to be injected into. And those are actually distributed all over the world. Turns out that North America has some of the best geology, and as my friend Julio Friedmann likes to say, is the Saudi Arabia of pore space. But those are the kinds of features: young sedimentary basins, interbedded sandstones and shales of some thickness, and of course the world's oil and gas fields. It's not hard to find places to put CO2. Let me just finish with that.
Well, I guess this is good news for all of us in the U.S. Craig, can you hear me okay?
I can, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, JP Brisson from Latham and Watkins. JP, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Craig, and thank you everyone for joining, and my apologies for the delay. The technology worked yesterday, but apparently not today. So I am now dialing in from my 9-year-old computer. So my 9-year-old son computer. So I am happy that I finally was able to join you. As a follow-up question, Steve, can you tell us about the permanence of geological sequestration and the potential issues associated with physical integrity when one injects CO2 on the ground?
Sure, and this is a reasonable concern, and that's why there are as governments and regulatory bodies start to get serious about this, they establish protocols for what is becoming a more familiar term, which is reservoir surveillance. So monitoring is a very important part, so that one actually knows that what you think is going to happen in the subsurface is actually happening. The good news is that a well-chosen site, one that is well characterized and relatively well, quite well understood through seismic surveys and other geophysical surveys, drilling to explore for wells, to look carefully at the geology, one can have pretty high confidence that the CO2 compressed as a liquid is going to stay there. It has a lot of the physical characteristics of oil, actually, which is why it's used for enhanced oil recovery. And we know that geology can contain fluids for millions of years. So it's not a great surprise that we have fairly high confidence, and the 20 or so CCS projects around the world have confirmed this. And I want to emphasize storing CO2 underground is solid science. It's settled science. This is not a research project. This can be done. We know it can be done. And we surveil the reservoirs to make sure that the CO2 stays in the places that Mother Nature has contained other fluids for millions of years.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Let's change gears a little bit. You know, we've been discussing geology and sequestration. Now that we have established those basic foundational blocks, let's talk about the technology, right? So some concerns in the past was about the fact that the technology wasn't there. If it was there, it was cost prohibitive. And that, frankly, you know, most of the attempts at CCS have not been successful so far. May I ask Beth, who actually works in Canada, so fellow Canadian, welcome, Beth. You have been working on an actual CCS project for a number of years, which has been successful. Can you give us your perspective on whether CCS is feasible, whether it is actually taking place at locations other than Canada, and give us a sense of an overview of what's currently happening in this area?
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks, JP. So I just really want to touch on Steve's point about this being proven and demonstrated. So the Boundary Dam facility is a coal facility that has carbon capture on it. It's the world's first operating commercial scale CCS facility. It's been operating since 2014. But what I want to say is I'm going to talk about that facility, but I am going to talk about how we can go beyond coal to industrial process emissions, and how also in some areas it is still necessary to look at it in the power sector as well. So don't turn your ears off just because I'm talking about coal right now. I'm also going to talk a little bit about costs dropping. So with the Boundary Dam facility, it has the, even though it's called a dam, it's not a hydro dam, it's actually a coal power plant, and it has the capacity to capture 1 million tons a year. It's stored over 4 million tons in the Weyburn oil field. And I want to just let you know, to just segue in from the storage piece, that field in Canada has actually been storing for 2 decades, over 35 million tons of CO2, most of that coming from North Dakota. So actually, Canada and the US, being a North America panel here, have actually worked together to capture and store CCS for decades. So with the Boundary Dam facility, how it kind of works is, if you can clean up coal, you can clean up anything. It's a post-combustion capture, and so coal is the dirtiest emission out there. You have to separate all the different particles, and then you finally can access the CO2. Once we access the CO2, we actually compress it into a liquid, supercritical liquid, and put it under the ground, just like our friends were talking about earlier. And with that, what we've done is we've proven it, we've understood it, we've de-risked it, so deployment can now occur. And that's kind of what the International CCS Knowledge Center is built for. Based on our hands-on lessons learned and expertise, we can actually come out to any facility and figure out how to do this for you. And what we've done recently is we went 12 kilometers down the road, found another very comparable power plant, coal plant, that's double the size. And just by studying that facility in a very, in-depth feasibility study, we found that based on lessons learned and economies of scale, it can be 67% cheaper to capture CO2. And that's a big drop. We can capture 2 million tons per year capacity at $45 US a ton. And so this is starting to make this more cost effective. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about in terms of capture. The Boundary Dam plant has the ability to capture 90% of the emissions off the coal plant, making it much cleaner than any switch to a natural gas combined cycle facility right now. But also, our study shows that working with renewables, so going hand in hand with the ramping up and ramping down, we can capture up to 97% of the emissions. That's fantastic, because people are always saying, oh, CCS versus renewables. This way we can actually work together. So I think that's another thing I really wanted to talk about. So the other piece in terms of power generation, there's currently 2.4 million tons a year capacity that is happening on power generation CCS, the Boundary Dam facility and the Petronova facility in Texas. the IEA says we need 1.5 billion tons actually by 2040 under their sustainable development scenario. And the last thing I'll say about the power sector is that if you look at a place like China, China coal plants actually emit 7.3 billion tons a year of CO2. And not that we don't need domestic action, we need to act domestically 100%. But if you retrofitted between 8 and 9% of those coal facilities in China alone, it would equal all of Canada's emissions. So just something to think about there. So moving beyond coal, because I think that's really important, and you saw it on the first chart that Julio was talking about industrial emissions, et cetera. There are 21 facilities currently in operation, and actually I want to really give a shout out right now to a project we've collaborated on that came online this week. The Alberta Carbon Trunk Line acts as an infrastructure hub near Alberta in the industrial heartland, and what it does is it's actually capturing off of two low-hanging fruit options. Those are fertilizers and refineries. So the Nutrien fertilizer facility and the Sturgeon refinery are able to capture 1.6 million tons a year to put it into a trunk line that basically has branches to take from different sources and bring it out to different sinks, if you will. So that whole trunk line has a 14 million ton capacity. And it's these types of projects that are really advancing globally. We are in this very similar area now working on a feasibility study on cement. Now, cement and coal are very similar, so this is one of the reasons why we decided to move into this. But by 2060, again, under the International Energy Agency's Sustainable Development Scenario, 10 billion tons of CO2 needs to be captured from iron and steel, 5 billion tons from cement, and 14 billion tons from the chemicals industries. So there's a lot of work to be done. And let's not forget, there's also the option to get negative emissions. And we see that coming out of the IPCC scenarios with bioenergy CCS. So I'll leave it there. I know it was a lot of information, but you can always check out our website or feel free to ask any questions.
No, thank you very much, Beth. And did you mention the figure of $55 per ton for the new project down the road from Boundary Dam?
$45 US a ton.
Wow, okay. Because we're going to talk about the value of LCFS and 45Q credits, so that's an important figure to keep in mind.
Yes, and what I really want to emphasize there, JP, is this is when you don't do it on your own. The value of working with people that have already done this makes an incremental difference on reducing. So that's why we all have to collaborate on this CCS. It's in its infancy, and we can't all say, I'm a leader in CCS and I'll do it by myself. There are people out there and resources out there to collaborate with to bring down costs more rapidly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, Beth. Julio, turning this over to you for a moment. You know, Beth described a number of CCS applications that she's been working on in Canada. We have here a couple of pictures from the National Petroleum Council's publication in 2019. Can you give us a little more color about which of those applications represent a specific opportunity for the U.S., which were not perhaps specifically mentioned by Beth?
Well, happy to. Again, I want to underscore one or two things that have already been said as a way to start this conversation. The first is that the technology is established. We've been capturing CO2 from industrial facilities since 1938. We've been doing deep injection and disposal of CO2 since 1972. We've run CCS projects just for climate benefits since 1996. Almost all of that has actually been done at industrial facilities. And so it's important to realize that, again, this has a broad application base. One of the biggest CCS projects in the world and in the country is, in fact, at an ethanol plant at Archer Daniels Midland in Decatur, Illinois. That project injects about 1 million tons of CO2 a year, and in fact, cuts the carbon footprint of that fuel by 50%. So it's a big carbon reduction associated with this. And in fact, there are hundreds of ethanol plants around the country where the capture cost is very low, where the capture cost is on the order of 20 or 30 bucks a ton all in. And in those contexts, that's low-hanging fruit. The same is true for things like refineries and chemical productions, and in particular, hydrogen facilities. Where hydrogen is made today from hydrocarbons, you can get about 60% of that carbon dioxide for the same kind of low costs, about $30 a ton. And if you wanted to get all of the CO2 emissions from that facility, you could get it for about $50, $55 a ton. So it's a way to get decarbonized hydrogen to market quickly. This diagram from the International Energy Agency underscores those kinds of points. About half of the CCS that's going to be done worldwide will be done in industrial facilities. And 70% of CCS that's going to be done around the world is going to be done in non-OECD countries, countries like India and China and Southeast Asia and Kazakhstan and places like this. And this creates an opportunity actually for US companies to develop technology and export those and field them into new markets. So in addition to that, though, I want to come back to your core point. There are ways today through existing policies to commercialize these things, to actually reduce tonnage to the atmosphere, really reduce emissions, and at the same time get a return on investment. And that opportunity is fairly new.
To me, that's the game changer, right? I mean, I guess there are 2 points I take from what you just said, right? I think the first point is we may have a marginal abatement cost, range where perhaps on one hand we have more costly capture systems, which, for example, could be associated with perhaps coal emissions, right? Which we just heard about. But I think what I'm hearing you say, Julio, is that on the other hand, we have some low-hanging fruits. I'm not sure they are low-hanging fruits, but they are more cost-effective because there's more experience with capturing the CO2, and just because the emissions releases are less complex to handle. And those would include, as I heard you say, ethanol refineries and also traditional oil and gas refineries through steam methane reforming. So I think these are very, very important points. Turning into Maris now, I know you are working on a very significant and potentially game-changing project in California. Can you tell us about that?
So glad you asked. Yes, of course. There's several projects going on in California right now, and I'm obviously focused on one for California Resources Corporation, the company that I work for. And we have in the Central Valley a 550 megawatt natural gas fired power plant, and it sits on top of a 100-year oil field. And this used to be the National Petroleum Reserve, and so it's been producing oil and natural gas for a very long time. And so, and before that, it held oil and natural gas in its pore space for a very long time. And so here's where in California we have all these opportunities. This is an amazing opportunity where the source of the CO2 is sitting directly on top of where we want to put it and put it back in the ground. And so this is an enhanced oil recovery project. This oil field is still active, still producing oil and natural gas. A lot of that gas goes to the power plant, so you're sort of cycling it back to where it came from. And we're potentially looking at a second phase of this project that is just pure sequestration, so it's not enhanced oil recovery. So there's a lot of opportunity. It's 75 square miles. It's a huge field. So right now we are working our way through the Air Resources Board's low carbon fuel standard application, and there's a lot in there. And there's a lot of permitting, and we'll talk about permitting, I know, in a little bit. But fortunately, in this field, because it is ours, we own it, we've been operating it for a while. It takes away some of the issues that you can have with the CCS project. Since we own the land, we own the pore space. And since we don't have to move it anywhere, we're not worried about lack of infrastructure, lack of pipelines. We have, pipelines that run all over the hill. We have wells that penetrate. We have wells that can monitor for CO2. So there's a lot of advantages that make this a really ideal location for storing CCS. And so that is, we're working through various permits. And we're looking at about 1.4 million metric tons a year of CO2 that we're going to capture and sequester in the first phase. So it's a lot, and it's down in Kern County where we, this is heavily dependent on oil and natural gas. So this is just continuing with keeping folks there, keeping folks employed. And it's a place where people, and we'll talk about that also later, just sort of the public perception. People are comfortable in Kern County with things being stored in the ground, more so than places where they're not as familiar with it. So there's still a lot of education that needs to happen around our project and around CCS in general. But we've got it. It's moving forward. We've got a lot of exciting things happening down there at that project. And if other folks want to talk about any other projects, that's obviously the one that I know the most about.
No. I think this is great. I actually visited your website yesterday again, and I see that you have already a lot of information publicly available on the CRC project in Elk Hills, and I think it's fantastic, right? It's there's limited need to land disturbance associated with a pipeline because you're sitting right on top of it. We are putting it back where it used to be. Conceptually, I think this is a very valuable proposition. So I think it's really exciting that CRC is innovating in this area and taking the lead in California with this project. I, for myself, look forward to seeing, how the project will continue to develop. So thank you, Maris, for this description. Let me turn the discussion towards financials, right? So we've already started, hitting at that right from the beginning when Beth was talking about some of the cost implications of her project. Julio, can you continue that discussion for us, right? We all remember the McKinsey curve with one price for CCS all the way in the $200 range, right? And now I'm on this panel, I'm hearing 55, 45. So can you kind of simplify for us what is happening with the cost? What has happened? Why are we talking about 55 today, but we were at 300 less than 10 years ago? And we have here a slide that is illustrative in that regard.
Let me say a couple of things. First of all, McKinsey was wrong. They were just wrong in 2009. They were wrong about a whole bunch of things on this. And I think it's important to be clear-eyed about that. It is also objectively wrong for them to assert that an entire sector can be decarbonized at one price. Ultimately, the price varies a lot by technology, by application, by fuel, by a whole bunch of different kinds of things. So this kind of a marginal abatement cost curve, which was constructed by Jeff Brown at Stanford University as part of this study, looked actually at every emitting unit in North America and came up with a specific price for them as a function of these kinds of things. What the heat rate was for the facility, what was the CO2 concentration, what was the availability and cost of power and energy. And it ends up being quite different. And so there are these low-hanging fruit options, which are below $50 a ton. And we can get a certain amount of that today, say, using the 45Q tax credit. For other things like cement or natural gas power, the cost is incrementally higher. The last thing that I'll add to this is, of course, since 2009, we now have 20 projects around the world. We have a dozen companies offering technology that they can use to do the decarbonizing. We have learning by doing. We have performance guarantees. We have technology advancements, and all of these have led to cost reductions. And a number of companies out there are prepared to announce major cost reductions this year and next. And if they are successful, we will actually see this curve drop substantially in the same way that, say, the costs for solar power or wind power have also dropped.
Fascinating. Thank you, Julio. This slide is from the 2019 National Petroleum Council report. I encourage everyone on this phone call to take a look at that. There's an executive summary, which is about 100 pages, which is long, but very informative. So this is obviously a very good source of information. So we've already mentioned, two sources of potential revenues for CCS project. One is the LCFS program in California, and the second one is the IRS 45Q tax credit program. So let's just talk about them briefly. Maris, can you, I mean, you being in California and you being in Sacramento and having to speak with ARB all the time, can you tell us a little more about the LCFS program and why is this so significant when someone looks at a marginal abatement cost curve here, where there's actually a lot of opportunities under $200, right? So yeah.
Right. And so LCFS is part of California's, whole portfolio of ways that we're looking to move towards carbon neutrality and reduce carbon. And so the LCFS focuses on transportation fluids. And so it's something that's open to oil refineries and upstream production facilities. So that's like the project that I'm working on. We're an upstream facility, ethanol refineries, which we've talked about. And it also includes direct air capture anywhere in the world. And right now, those credits are at about $180 to $200. So it's a huge part of how projects are going to be made to happen in California. And it came out in 2018, so it's still relatively new. There's a couple of projects, including ours, that are sort of making their way through it. But it's a bit of trailblazing right now because it's new and it's robust, I will say. So it's going to be an important part. This and 45Q, potentially is an important part of any CCS project that deals with transportation fuels. You need it.
No, this is very helpful. It's very interesting to see how ARB essentially took an approach which was developed for the cap and trade program, the concept of a protocol, replicated that approach right under the LCFS regulation, which in fact predated cap and trade when you think about it. And then it is also very interesting to see how some of the concepts developed by cap and trade, by ARB on the cap and trade, such as the set-aside program under the forestry protocol, have been essentially brought into the CCS protocol. So we also see from a policy and regulatory perspective some synergies between the program. And the reason why I'm saying this is I know a lot of people on the phone right now are very familiar with those protocols. So when one reads the CCS protocol to the LCFS regulation, one realizes, that there are actually some complementary synergies between the work of ARB across its programs, which, kind of makes sense since, these have been instruments that have been successful in other contexts.
Right. It's great. Yeah, no, CARB is looking at carbon neutrality more holistically than they were and looking at what all the options are. And that's really important, that it's not a one size fits all or a magic secret sauce that is going to get us there. It's a combination of a lot of different things that are going to move us towards our carbon neutrality goals. Absolutely.
Perfect. So Marissa, I'll come back to you on LCFS later. I've already received some questions on the email. Let's go to Beth so that we can talk about the 45Q, right? So that's the second potential source of revenue. Beth, can you tell us more about that program, which is a federal U.S. tax program?
Sure, yeah. So 45Q is an environmental lever used in the States. It's a production tax credit, essentially. And the great thing about 45Q is it actually can be stacked. This tax credit can be stacked with the LCFS. So the IRS actually released proposed regulations last week, May 28th, and they currently have a 60-day comment period. They provide guidance regarding the new tax credits for carbon capture and storage. And what they look like is, first of all, there's a $50 a ton tax credit for permanent sequestration and up to $35 a ton for utilization, including, of course, enhanced oil recovery. And this tax credit had been there previously, but it wasn't high enough of an incentive to incent as many projects as intended. And prior, there was also a limit to how much could be claimed for this. Now there is no limit on the tons that qualify, which is kind of a great thing as well. These regulations address questions of, procedures to determine secure storage, who can use the credit, a third-party process to claim the tax credit, as well as standards for measuring utilization, which is great, very in-depth. So there are about 30 identified commercial CCS projects in the US right now, already underway thanks to 45Q. We'll see how they end up rolling out. But let's remember, this has been a long overdue release, and we have to get going on those CCS projects to begin construction by the end of 2023 in order to qualify. And the CCS projects, you know, you have to plan, you have to engineer, you have to permit, you have to finance. There's a lot of things that go into this, like any large capital project. So not to mention any COVID related delays and investment impacts there. So I wanted to say that in Canada, there isn't a 45Q type incentive like this. Because Canada doesn't usually use performance tax credits as an environmental lever, but you know, enabling first mover across the board, enabling first mover support, creating a variety of financial incentives, and driving maybe even policy parity in terms of subsidies are all different types of things that we can look at for incenting these projects to happen.
And Beth, what did you say, or if anyone can say, give that answer? What is the range of the tax credit under 45Q?
So it's $50 a ton for permanent sequestration and up to $35 a ton for utilization, including enhanced oil recovery.
Got it. And a key requirement in the law, in the law is that the project needs to start construction. That is a legally defined term, which has a lot of practice under the renewable energy tax credit program. Before January 1, 2024, right? So that is actually creating an incentive for companies to get their projects together right now, because if one misses that deadline, obviously you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that would be lost in potential revenues for these projects. So thank you. That was a really helpful comment. So let me quickly finish off this conversation before we go to Q&A to talk about challenges, right? So I think we've established pretty clearly that, you know, CCS is required, right? There is a geology in the US and in California to do CCS project. We've established that the technology is there and it is also financially feasible and provides good, you know, investment return that, you know, some private equity fund or infrastructure fund should find attractive. So if all of this is kind of lined up, right, what are the challenges? What needs to happen to continue to enable the growth of that technology and deployment of the technology in the US? So first, very briefly, Maris, you mentioned permitting, right? So is permitting an issue, especially in California for CCS projects? It's a bit of a loaded question.
Yes, of course it is. I mean, for any project, you know, we're potentially 9 federal, 12 state, and then depending on where you are, local agencies reviewing and granting permits. Sometimes they have to be done in sequence. It includes California's Environmental Quality Act, and that is time consuming, obviously, and as it should be. So yes, very long lead times on permits, a lot of different permits, and just lack of clarity right now because there hasn't been any permitted projects. So as I said before, there's a lot of trailblazing that's going on with this. But everybody that we are working with from state, local, and federal is so supportive. We're just trying to find a way to fit everybody's individual project, but our project into the existing framework where it needs to, and make sure that there is a framework that we can work within. Yeah.
Steve, thank you, Maris. Steve, can I ask you a question? I mean, if CCS is a good opportunity, right, for the state of California, and there are permitting challenge, and you know, there's a federal deadline to access massive amounts of funding at the federal level, is there an opportunity for California to try to define a better framework, streamline, you know, not disregard, but just, you know, make sure that there's a more efficient process to achieve what we want to achieve in order to put a CCS project together?
So as Maris knows well, this is a challenge in California. It is a high regulation state. We value our environmental ethic here. But specifically, the state government understands that this is a challenge. And so there's a number of agencies that will be involved in the permitting of such a project. And a focus right now by the Newsom administration is to get all the players together and look carefully at how to organize the process so it lowers the risk that project proponents see in terms of regulatory risk. They don't want to go through 5 or 6 years of regulatory battlefield only to come up empty. So that is a focus by the NACW administration. There's tremendous interest in this, and I think we will see improvements in this over the next year or so, maybe 18 months. I think it is a focus.
Well, I really appreciate the comment. This is good to hear, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone in industry when we say that industry is ready to engage into a constructive discussion with the Newsom administration to find ways to do these things in a manner that protects the environment, addresses social justice issues, which will inevitably arise, but also allow people to meet a federal program deadline and help California meet its goals. So thank you, Steve. Let me finish, the panelist section of this call by doing a lightning round of questions, right? Which, I've mentioned environmental justice, right, and environmental protection. So my question, I would love for each of you on the panel to provide a quick 30-second response before we go to questions from the audience. Can you tell me, is California, are the U.S. ready for CCS? If we were to do massive CCS deployment in California, can we get everyone on board? And as Maris indicated, can we get the community to support these types of activities as furthering an important state goal? Who would like to take this first question? Julio.
So it's important to realize.
I'll jump in. Go ahead, Julio. Go ahead.
If you don't object, it's important to realize there's not one public. There's many different publics and many different stakeholders, and they all have a voice and they all have wishes. In parts of California, like Kern County, as Steve mentioned, they're ready to go today. I would not expect the same thing as Marin County. In this, the most important thing is to know that if people have questions, there are answers. And there are processes that can be used to address those questions, whether it is environmental justice or jobs.
Thank you. Steve?
Yes, and I think it's important for the public to be educated. I think we really need to, the public doesn't have a good association with subsurface activities. Look no further than Oklahoma. They did some really stupid things with their produced waters from production of natural gas and created a whole bunch of earthquakes that they didn't have to and actually were predictable. So the public needs to be, we need to have education and time for the public to understand the depth and robustness of this technology and the fact that it's been proven throughout the world. And that, I think, will go a long way to gaining some public acceptance as they understand this is a technology not terribly different from wind and solar and other new technologies that are critical for our climate future.
Thank you, Steve. Who wants to go next?
I can. So is the U.S., is California, is the world ready for CCS? And the answer is yes. If you have the geology, if you have the emission source, let's do this. There's not a lot of time to take. And I want to just say that we at the Boundary Dam facility always welcome people coming here to Saskatchewan to actually see this firsthand. We've had people from all over the world, including indigenous tribes from South Africa, who have basically stalled CCS projects in South Africa have come, seen it, understood it, and it's actually allowed things to progress. So we always welcome people. We had the president of COP from Poland actually come as well. You know, we're happy to welcome people here to see it firsthand.
I guess this is a friendly invitation, as you would expect from a Canadian, for all of us to go up and visit the project. Thank you, Beth. Maris?
I mean, we need to be, and we need to get there, and however we do that, it's having projects that are successful. It's education, but there's no models that don't show how important it is to physically sequester carbon, to pull it out of the air, to prevent it from going in the air, certainly, but this permanent sequestration it's essential. We're not going to meet any climate goals without doing it. So we need to get there. And specifically in California, you know, everybody I talk to, and that's like basically anybody who holds still, I'm telling about this project, but that's, you know, from my neighbors to people at the Capitol to the regulators, everyone is so supportive of it. It's just the pathway for getting there. So having a more defined path, I was definitely listening very avidly when Steve was talking, and just how are we really going to get there? And we're on our way, but we need to use everything in sort of our collective toolbox. You know, there's a lot of ingredients to the secret sauce. It's not just one solution to meeting climate goals and carbon neutrality goals. So we just need to get there.
Wonderful. Well, that is a positive note to end on. I have received a couple of questions by email, and Jenny and Craig, I don't know if you have more questions in the background, but let me just start off with one. And this one's coming from well, I will not identify the person. The question, unless that person sends me an email, so I will be watching the email. A question, maybe, I don't know if it's Julio or Maris, but if someone does a CCS project in California, which is not tied to a transportation fuel, so the LCFS credit is not available. You know, can you stack, you know, a cap and trade avoided cost type of rent in addition to a 45Q credit? And is that a way potentially to finance, for example, a CCS project at the level of a cement plant in California?
So I love this question. Not quite yet, and it's something that we're working on, and it's just, since CCS is, I wouldn't say infancy, but maybe sort of toddlerhood. So we're getting there, and it's something that we and a lot of folks have been talking to the ARB about, the Air Resources Board, because there's an acknowledgement that that piece is not quite in place, and that it needs to be in order to get these things going before 45Q expires. So it's a great question, and ask ARB. Let's get them to do it, because it's not all about transportation fuels. Again, it's about all the tools in the toolbox. So everywhere else, we need to be able to administer the CCS as well. Great question.
Yeah, Maris, you are 100% right. Yeah, go ahead, Julio.
Just very briefly to add to that, anybody who gets 45Q tax credits must do monitoring under subpart RR of the Clean Water Act, and it must be certified and qualified by the IRS. I say this because that standard is extremely high, but groups like Carbon Action Reserve or American Carbon Registry or Gold Standard have not yet put CCS into their processes. And so there's an opportunity to think about how to better integrate these kinds of standards.
Great point.
Hold on, I'm getting questions via email. Oh, very good question here. Is there any data, to your knowledge, on how CCS, especially post-combustion CCS, impacts criteria pollutant?
So that data exists, and we know it from projects like Boundary Dam and Petronova in the US. It is generally the case that you see something like a 90 or a 95% drop in criteria pollutants following post-combustion retrofits. And it is, in some cases, certain kinds of pollutants, you get even more profound drops, well beyond 99% reduction.
Yeah, so we actually get 100% of the SO2 comes off of the Boundary Dam facility, which is like acid rain. You have to get that out before you can even access the CO2, right? So 50% of the nitrous oxide is also removed from a separate process. And then you're getting large amounts of particulate matter 2 and 2.5 and particulate matter 10. So this is something that, for instance, Asia is really looking at because they're looking to clean up their air before they even get to the fact that they're cleaning up their CO2 in a lot of their coal plants. So sometimes we get asked about CCS application just to clean up those things.
Great, great. Well, thank you for that. We are on the hour, so I would like to bring this to a close. I would like to thank the Climate Action Reserve for organizing this webinar. I would like to thank our panelists, Beth, Julio, Steve, and Maris, in the order they appear on my screen, for their wonderful contribution to today's discussion. The way I see today's discussion is really the start of a longer discussion and a longer journey as we deploy CCS in California and in the US. And I very much hope that we will have the opportunity to have a similar conversation in the future to continue to progress in our thinking with regard to these issues. Any other comment to conclude?
No, thank you for
Great.
having me.
Thanks, fun.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's been a treat. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and we will see you soon. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye.
Goodbye.